Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first virtual event of our four-part summer series. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. I'd like to acknowledge the unusual circumstances we're in this year, where we're all getting very good at Skype and Zoom and WebEx and Teams and all these other great technologies. I am Cathy Langham. I'm president of Langham Logistics. I'm also very honored to serve as president of the Economic Club of Indiana and look forward to helping moderate some of our summer series as well as upcoming full season that starts in September. As you may know, the Economic Club is a forum for Central Indiana's current and emerging leaders to be challenged by extraordinary speakers to think about and advance ideas that move us all forward. The exciting thing is that the Economic Club has really been working to make these lunch discussions more intimate, more direct, more one-on-one. And this Zoom meeting, I think, is really a great way to do that. In fact, we're bringing you speakers today that we would not have been able to connect with otherwise because Beth, for instance, is in Rome and Kip is traveling there tomorrow. So this virtual summer series will feature leadership perspectives from various sectors to weigh in on social and economic impacts of current events. Before introducing today's guests, I'd like to also take a moment to thank our presenting sponsor, Luma, as well as the outstanding group of platinum sponsors. Both are Hoosiers who have been involved in multi-generational farming and have left their homes, their state, their country to move to Rome to impact food security on a global level. Today, we are joined by the Deputy Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO of the United Nations, Beth Bechdol. Beth has been Deputy Director General of FAO just since March of 2020, so her perspective is fresh. Prior to that, she led AgriNovus, Indiana, the state's ag bioscience organization, and has led that since 2014. Beth also served as former director of agribusiness strategies at Ice Miller. Beth has been a high-profile leader in the state's emerging ag bioscience business and has helped make Indiana a globally recognized in the development of new innovative products and services. We look forward to Beth sharing a little bit more about herself today. Kip Tom. We are also pleased to have with us today Ambassador Kip Tom of the U.S. mission of the UN agencies in Rome. Kip was confirmed in April of 2019, so his perspective is pretty fresh too. Ambassador Tom is an agribusiness leader who transformed a seventh-generation farm in northern Indiana to one of the largest commodity businesses in the Midwest. His business has grown to over 25,000 acres with locations in the United States as well as Argentina. Kip also served as a critical member of the board of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation when Mitch Daniels was governor and is involved in several philanthropic organizations focusing on food security and other important issues. We look forward to hearing more from Ambassador Tom today as well. So Ambassador Tom and Deputy Director Beth Bechdol, please spend a few minutes introducing the structure and the goals of FAO and any other UN organizations you're involved in, as well as each of your roles in the organization. Also, please spend a few minutes on the impact of COVID-19 on the global food supply. Thank you. Ambassador?
Cathy, thank you, Cathy. And it seems like just yesterday where we held that first meeting with Governor Daniels back in, I think, 2005, and actually launched the Indiana Economic Development Corporation and certainly understood the value that delivered in creating jobs and improving Hoosier lives. So great experience that we shared in our lifetime here. So thank you again for that kind introduction. So a little bit about what I do in Rome. I serve as the U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies in Rome. I've got 6 different agencies that I work with there. Mainly, though, they're focused on food security. The first one is the World Food Program. This year, to probably be nearly an $8.5 billion organization. And this organization goes out and produces or contributes food in a sense to provide immediate relief for those who are food insecure. Then the next organization is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which Beth serves as the Deputy Director General there. We certainly appreciate that relationship, but we say that we know that the Food and Agriculture Organization is supposed to create and does and will create resilience and capacity in farming systems across developing nations, making sure that someday these countries, these people can have the economic opportunities that so many others around the world are not able to access today. So this to me is one of the most important organizations because they will truly impact more people than anybody else. Then I have the International Fund for Agricultural Development. We work with the World Bank and a lot of countries around the world. We go out and support anything from commercial businesses in developing countries to smallholder farmers, making sure that they have the access to credit or grants to make sure that they too can feed themselves. And 3 smaller organizations, UNIDRAW, we go out and perfect private law, where banking and lending institutions from around the world can perfect, for instance, liens on mining, agriculture, and construction equipment, no matter where those assets are at. A very effective organization with about 300 attorneys. The next one is the International Development Law Organization. This is an organization that goes out and perfects public law, where we work with countries like Afghanistan, where we actually change laws to enforce that women can now own land, as an example, something that's very important. And lastly, ICROM, which is an organization which is focused on cultural preservation. But as I said, the most important ones is the World Food Program and the FAO, where Beth is at today. As I said, the World Food Program, the success we're seeing there is our food systems around the world are doing a better job of feeding those that are in need around the world. We have less hungry today than we did back in 1900 or even 1950. But the reality is that number continues to grow as our population grows. We have nearly 820 million people around the world that are on the edge of hunger. We have about 135 million that are nearly IPC 3 or greater, which means they're almost on the edge of famine. What we've been telling global leaders, and we've been discussing this with them over the past 7-8 months, is we're setting up for the perfect storm here now with COVID. We could see that number grow by about another 130 million. So we could be having nearly 265 million people hungry. But yet today, the World Food Program is only able to feed about 100 million people a day. Now that's a big number, but that's something we do day in, day out. We're ramping up our ability to move food around the world as we speak. We went from 15 ocean vessels nearly to 24 ocean vessels. We've increased our flights. We're moving nearly 700 additional flights a month, moving food and people around the world to make sure people can be fed. And at the same time, this comes at a period where it's tough to get across borders. As an example, at the Uganda and Kenya border here just 2 weeks ago, we had a 32-mile backup on each side. So we weren't able to get food resources across that line, and the people are so desperately in need. So I'll say this, as we look at the Food and Agriculture Organization, we've got to see them create this resilience and capacity. And I'll say in the past that it hasn't happened the way it should or at the pace it should have. I think today, we understand we need to bring in the private sector. We need to make sure that we bring in innovation along the way as well. And I really appreciate Beth coming on as the Deputy Director General at FAO, because I feel this organization will have a significant impact on feeding the hunger around the world. And just a brief part about that is, one thing I've witnessed as I've traveled across Africa over the past year. You see this so oftentimes. You'll get into an internally displaced people camp that may have 100,000 people in it. Some have been there nearly 4 generations. Can you imagine losing 4 generations of youth not having the opportunity to get an education, get good health care, or create economic opportunity? But what happens is when people lose hope, when they lose faith in their ability to feed themselves, they migrate. And when they migrate across borders, they get caught up in human trafficking. We know that's nearly 20 million people a year get caught up in that. Next, we understand that it's they get involved in extremism, joining terrorist groups, very well funded. And we see that continue to occur all the time. I've seen this occur actually in Yemen, where we've seen young boys as young as 10 and 12 years old pulled away from their parents as they were going to go get their food aid to go fight with the Houthis in Yemen. So the situation is dire. And this may seem like a selfish statement, but if we can't achieve a food secure world, peace and security at our own national borders, and those who are allies will be challenged, because we obviously have the impacts of terrorism around the world. So we have to make sure that we have the ability to improve lives and livelihoods as we move around the world, whether it's the World Food Program or the FAO. So as we see that budget increase at the World Food Program, we've nearly 4 years ago, the U.S. was contributing, or excuse me, the whole budget was about $3.7 billion. Over the past 4 years, we're at about $8.5 billion now. The U.S. is the most philanthropic nation of all countries in the world, giving this organization almost at $3.5 billion this year. We expect it to go almost $4 billion. So we understand the importance. This has got the attention of Secretary Pompeo, Vice President Pence, the President himself. They understand the importance of this. So I ask all of you today that are listening on this phone call, please feel free and talk to our senators, our governor, and many others that have the ability to shape federal policy to make sure they understand the importance of these organizations and why we need to continue to fund them to make sure we have an impact on food security around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
So I'll take the baton from there. It's nice to see a lot of very familiar names over in the participant list column here. A lot of old friends and colleagues. So hello from Rome. It's been a very interesting 3 months. I think I hit my 100 days just about a week ago. I got here on March 6th, started on March 9th, and our entire headquarters was closed just 4 days later with the situation in Italy related to Corona. So I have had an extra challenge of not only learning this organization, but while Zoom is nice and more convenient these days to connect to people, it has been a very challenging time to begin to build personal relationships, not only with my fellow senior management leaders here at FAO, but all of my colleagues and the people across this organization. So we are now starting to come out of lockdown here in Italy. I'm actually back in the office here a few days a week. And so I'm looking forward to getting that opportunity. But let me tell you a little bit about FAO structurally, a bit more detail. This is our 75th year, so it's an anniversary year for us. We are the UN agency that primarily focuses on the promotion of food security and nutrition. We have 194 members, the United States, Ambassador Tom being one of those, but as I like to say, I have 193 other Kip Toms to be responsive to work alongside and to support in their efforts to promote food security and nutrition. We have 13,000 people. So for those of you who knew me in Indiana and were familiar with Agronovis, going from a team of 6 to a team of 13,000 has been a bit of a transition. We have about a $2.8 billion budget, some of that coming from, as Ambassador Tom mentioned, assessed contributions that come from member country budgets, and then voluntary contributions that actually are continuing to grow at a more rapid pace as governments really do begin to think about a portion of their national budgets that go to UN agencies as a whole. We have our colleagues, the 13,000 people, spread across 130 countries. 3,000 of the employees are here at headquarters in Rome. And so a big proportion of our team is actually, to Kip's point, in-country offices really working to not only advance knowledge about food insecurity and nutrition, but also to really focus on, as he said, resilience and development. And so while the World Food Program has very much the humanitarian and the emergency response responsibilities that the ambassador mentioned, I sometimes like to say that FAO is in it for the long haul. We are there to provide sometimes, and very sadly, the hard work and the heavy lift that can often come when a crisis starts to resolve itself, but it's all the implications of what comes as a result of that crisis. How much of the food supply, food chain, other kinds of social protections, rural development, rural community livelihoods start to become broken because of that crisis that has emerged. And FAO's colleagues and leadership are really intended to be those sustained, on the ground, technical experts to really make sure that in many countries we try to build back better. I have a couple of slides, Cathy, that if perhaps Michelle or colleagues could put up, I'd like to just highlight a couple of key points for the folks on the phone. And some of these the ambassador had mentioned as well, but I think it gives people a perspective on where we are struggling to work through food insecurity and famine, and also a little bit to Cathy, your question about sort of the impacts of COVID-19. So I would say that because of COVID, we are really facing right now a crisis within a crisis that is unprecedented in many ways. An already dire food and nutrition security situation has already sadly deteriorated in the weeks and months that we have been facing together as a world, COVID-19. And as the ambassador mentioned, over 820 million people continue to suffer from hunger worldwide, and nearly 2 billion people are experiencing some form of malnutrition. Just about a month ago, a consortium of global partners, the Global Network Against Food Crises, which FAO is a part of, released this particular global report, which focuses on the more acute and crisis situations around us. And if you flip to the next slide, I'll give you just a few of the highlights on that. In 2019, almost 135 million people in 55 countries were classified as being in a crisis condition or worse. And this, unfortunately, marks the highest number in the 4 years since this particular report was launched. You can see geographically that Africa remains the continent most affected, accounting for 54% of this global total number. And the number of people affected by the crisis in Africa increased just 8 million over the last year. Asia and the Middle East come next, with the hotspots being Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan. And so obviously, with what we all know about geopolitical forces and conflict, it's no surprise that when you think about the conflict-ridden situations in those three countries especially, that as well as economic shocks serve to be really some of the main drivers of food crisis and food insecurity in the world. But we're also finding that weather extremes, climate change, and other natural resource trends are also pushing more people towards food insecurity and food hunger. And while this slide doesn't show it, the ambassador mentioned as well that we know that there are another 180+ million people in 47 different countries that are considered stressed or on the verge of a food crisis, and 71% of those are in Africa. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. This is the last one that I wanted to show. This now demonstrates to me the COVID challenge. So if we now layer the prevalence of undernourishment, so focus on the places where you see the darkest green, with now the red circles, which are a bit dated, probably a couple of weeks old, but confirmed COVID-19 cases. I think this picture shows just how compelling and how important it is that we have considerable work ahead of us in thinking about a global response and new ways of working together as we think to protect the global food and agricultural system. You can go ahead and take the slides off. But I think this is where for Agrinovus, boy, that was a slip. For FAO, it's also a challenge for Agrinovus too. But for FAO, we are really now beginning to think through how do we make sure that we are mindful about the medium to long-term implications of COVID. And so that is impact on young people, that's impact on labor and migrant workers, that's the impact on rural sustainability and livelihoods. And so this is now the part of our response where we're beginning to think about the next 2, the next 3, the next 5 years, where as this global recession continues to weigh on all of us, these are going to be challenging times and challenging conditions to get these countries already afflicted back to a place where their agricultural production systems, their logistics, their supply chains, and all of the things that go along in their economic return somewhat come back to normal. And so working alongside not only the World Food Program, our member countries, but also a whole host of other NGOs. The ambassador mentioned the importance to us of private sector, finding new and innovative ways that we can partner with them, which admittedly is something that FAO has not done very well in the past, but changing that mindset and changing that openness to find new partnerships and to bring new collaborations to these really big challenges is a very important part of what we're working on. I might just sort of wrap up, and I think for just point of interest, maybe describe just really quickly kind of the role that I have and the areas of work that I'm involved in. So we have 3 deputies across the organization. We're managed by a director general. He was elected to his role in August of last year. 3 deputies, a chief economist and a chief scientist who serve as the cabinet that reports to the director general. So I'm the newest member of the team, still trying admittedly to get my arms around a portfolio and a group of agencies and divisions inside the organization. But at a high level, the areas that I tend to focus most on and have responsibility for include resource mobilization. In the private sector and the outside world, we call that fundraising. But here inside the UN, we call it resource mobilization. Private sector engagement, we are working on an entirely new private sector engagement strategy that the ambassador will have to vote on in December. So I'm hopeful that we'll get an affirmative vote there. Innovation, but I also have responsibility for one of our technical divisions. We are a knowledge center and we are also a technical organization. And I have oversight of what's called our plant protection division. So all things seeds, all things genetics, plant protection expertise. And as you think about the importance of getting more vibrant agricultural systems and production systems working in Africa and Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, making sure that they have really quality access to those kinds of inputs and to that part of agricultural production is really important as well. So Cathy, I'll leave it there and turn it back over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Wow. You both compressed an awful lot of information into a few minutes, and the first question that comes to mind to me for both of you is it sounds a little like eating the elephant. I mean, these are such big programs, and 13,000 employees around the country. How do you, Beth, and how do you, Kip, possibly figure out how to prioritize all this, number one? And number two, what does win look like for you at the end of the year?
So for us, we have to think about it really like any organization, especially a service-oriented organization. That's how I view FAO. We are led by, as far as metrics or KPIs might go, by what are called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of those, and FAO has primary responsibility for 5 of the 17, and we truly contribute to really all 17 when you think about them. But our guiding force and our guiding principle is SDG number 2, which is simply put, zero hunger. So Cathy, to your question, what does win look like? Zero hunger is what win looks like. But how do we get there? One bite at a time, one step at a time, one partnership at a time. And so for us, we obviously have reports, the likes of what I shared on the slides, that do give us on an annualized basis sort of a trajectory and a metric-based system, a quantification, as you will, to really help us understand if we're making an impact. And it's frustrating right now because we're not. Maybe that we're not making an impact, but these other forces at work in the world that are so frustratingly outside of your control are causing your metrics to go in the completely wrong direction right now. So you have to get more creative. You have to think about new, again, partnerships, more resources, more innovative tools, and more innovative solutions that you have the power to bring to bear on this. For us, the other part to it, which I think I had shared earlier with you, Cathy, is we've got a lot of internal efficiency and improvement gains to be made at FAO. So for me, I'm also involved in some of the things that are just a little more foundational and a little more organizational to FAO, of creating culture change inside our organization so that we can be faster, we can be leaner, we can be more creative to help serve and get to that larger term metric. We have just a number of things from an efficiency perspective. 13,000 people as a part of the UN multilateral system. You can imagine layers upon layers upon layers of bureaucracy and things that just never were really modernized or changed. And so for me in this role, not only do I want to continue to keep our eye on the larger goal, but I also see opportunities for internal efficiencies that make us leaner, make us more modern, make us more flexible and dynamic. And I hope that all of that starts to make our contributions to the larger goal and mission all that more effective.
Right. What I would add to that is I want to set the stage so people understand a little bit what we're dealing with, because everybody just thinks we're going into a lot of places probably, and they don't understand we're in the midst of conflict. I mean, if you look, we have wars going on in Syria and Yemen, where we have a lot of programs going on. We got the deepening crisis in places like South Sudan, Burkina Faso, the Central Sahel region. Then we have the desert locusts that's affecting nearly 20-some million people across the Horn of Africa. And then on top of that, we got economic crises in Lebanon affecting millions of Syrian refugees. We got issues in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Ethiopia, and the list continues to go on. And we haven't even begun to do anything in Venezuela right now. So the challenges are complex, but so I continue to go back and forth between FAO and what we really need to do there. And I think Director General Beth Bechdol is right on the right pathway, bringing private sector, bringing innovation along the way, repurposing a lot of the assets and human resources that are at FAO to make sure we create that resilience capacity. But over at the World Food Program, we got to meet this immediate need. And this was made public at a UN General Assembly here, UN Security Council meeting about 2 months ago. The Executive Director Beasley, in their modeling at the World Food Program, came up with this number that, if we do go into a deep recession, as being predicted by many economists around the world, our ability to access the funding we need and access the people that we need to get to, crossing these borders under COVID, we could see, this number's solid, 300,000 people a day for 3 months past due to the lack of food security. I mean, so that is what we're viewing as the crisis following the crisis. So as we prioritize, we're trying to see where we can go have the most impact, keep people alive, make sure we create that resilience capacity. But again, I come back to the heavy lifting long-term resides over at FAO, and that's where I have the most confidence of making a difference, because if we can't get FAO right, we can never put enough money into the World Food Program to continue to feed people. So that's a priority, FAO, and I'm glad Director Bechdol's there.
Ambassador Tom, just one quick follow-up question. I mean, you talk about getting across borders, and especially now, how are we working on that?
It's called diplomacy. There's been a lot of phone calls made to try to get, for instance, food trucks across borders. As I mentioned earlier, that was one of the challenges. But even we're delivering a lot of the resources that the World Health Organization used to deliver now. The World Food Program is, whether it's delivering polio vaccines, malaria medicines, personal protective equipment, I think we've been in about 89 or 90 some countries delivering equipment right now. But even landing a plane, unloading that equipment and taking them off right away, we have some country governments wanting to lock us down and put the pilots in 2 weeks of quarantine. We have ships coming into harbors that unload their food and then need to turn right back around and go get more food that are want to be quarantined. So we're making a lot of phone calls, the World Food Program is, and others, to make sure that we can keep these wheels moving forward so we don't have a gap in providing those food resources to people. So logistics, diplomacy, and making sure we have enough resources to move that food around the world is critical today.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I know we had somebody send a note asking about logistics, and of course that's near and dear to my heart, but what are the greatest supply chain challenges? I know you mentioned a couple just now, but any others this group should know about?
I would say some is trade. We've got a number of countries that have locked down supplies of some of their basic raw commodities that we used to source product from. I'm not going to mention those right now, but that's what's been disappointing, is that we have developed countries that have the cupboards that are full, that are worried about a longer term COVID effect, yet won't release their supplies to help feed some of the hunger around the world. And this is where I'll say this about the United States. We've stood strong, we've kept our borders open, we've kept our trade open, and we continue to be the leading supplier of commodities around the world to help feed people. And it's quite remarkable. When you get down to it, we can feed a lot of people. Each meal is going to cost about 28 to 30 cents. So they get the raw commodity and they produce it into their own meal, whatever it is. They grind it, they get a little oil with it. They're really pretty innovative in trying to figure out how to feed themselves just with the raw commodities. So that's how we can stretch so little money so far.
Yeah. Beth, anything to add to that? Or?
So we've been following, again, a lot of the challenges that the entire global food supply chain has had. In fact, this goes back to, I think, sort of some new ways of engaging with private sector partners. Alongside our chief economist, we have been organizing a number of private sector virtual roundtables here, where we've brought global leaders in the global grain trade, in the meat processing industry, the dairy sector, and also the input sector. So think fertilizer, agrochemicals, seeds, genetics. And that it's hard to imagine how novel of a concept that is, to have those kinds of real marketplace dialogues with private sector industry players about what we're seeing in the global system. And for me, it was imperative that we do that, because the only way we're going to be able to validate the things that we think we see in the marketplace is to actually talk to real players, real thought leaders, and real business people who are in the marketplace. And in each of those sectors, you find, somewhat different challenges, and you find differences, obviously, based on different parts of the world. In the meat processing sector, for example, it was, the United States that was clearly in crisis mode, as compared to Europe or South America or other parts of the world where you have animal agriculture or livestock production. And so learning about sort of the nuances of what was going on in the supply chain unique to the US helped us understand better sort of the downstream impacts that might affect trade. But overall, Cathy, what we really sort of, I think, learned and deduced from those kinds of conversations was that, really throughout all of this, very different than the food crisis we all experienced in 2007, 2008, food has been available through really these last 3 months of the COVID pandemic. The challenges have been accessibility, where and how, tied to lockdowns, tied to trade flows, tied to challenges with ports, and oftentimes it may not have even been that a port was closed by government decree, it was closed for worker safety. A lot of what we have all seen in terms of closures have been because companies and businesses and institutions have had to make decisions about employee well-being that then all of a sudden cascades to these other disruptions. So it's been in all parts of the sector. Some of it is, I think, coming back. What actually does concern me more and more is that in the last couple of weeks, I think, or the last few days, we've started to see, though, real significant upticks in the coronavirus cases in South America, Latin America, and Africa. And so as we think about the Southern Hemisphere, very much the developing world, we see some real concerns coming around, again, either supply chain and just the state of the affairs that they're facing there as well.
Okay. Well, I know there are a lot of dynamics politically also. Not only with the U.S. and you know, there is more of a nationalistic feeling than global feeling over the last few years, but then globally, you know, there's a lot of political unrest. Could each of you speak to that briefly?
Certainly. You know, when I think of that, I think about it in a couple different lights here. You know, I think about, one is the challenge we face at bringing innovation as one of the tools to really improve food security in, let's say, Africa as a continent as a whole. For the better part of the last 2 decades, a lot of the innovations that we've used in the developing world, in the U.S. in particular, that has reduced our dependency on fossil fuels, reduced our carbon emissions, reduced the usage of pesticides and fertilizer, using them in different manners and actually increasing productivity. Those systems have been proven in the United States, but yet some of the simple components of that, we haven't been able to get into a lot of these developing countries, into the hands of these smallholder farmers, to make sure they elevate themselves out of that cycle of poverty, giving them and their family economic opportunities. So that's particularly frustrating from a policy standpoint, and a political one as well. In fact, right now, Europe has what's called the Green Deal. They have a Farm to Fork initiative that they're wanting to see as the standard for the world. And it will come far from being able to meet the needs of feeding that hungry world while you know, making sure that we use the best of our resources and preserve them for future generations. As far as politically goes, you know, I know we have conversations with a number of our friends up in the EU in terms of supporting the World Food Program, you know, and that comes down to good relationships between the United States and a number of these countries. Germany has been very helpful. They're probably one of the second largest donors. The Gates Foundation, of course, comes in there as well. But there's a number of countries that really just haven't stepped up and played their part in feeding that hungry world on the capacity, on the immediate impact or immediate needs side of it. So, and as I said earlier, all the issues we face around the world on conflict is substantial, and that really complicates everything that we do here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so for us, very similarly, we have to be very balanced in the way we approach different countries' perspectives, different members' perspectives. And as I said earlier, you know, the United States and Ambassador Tom is just one of a constituency that's obviously quite global for us. And maybe, you know, one way that I can sort of explain some of FAO's challenges in the past is, at least I have seen them as an outsider coming in, where you can kind of see the impacts of quote unquote politics on doing good work, is over the last 25 years, as the emergence of biotechnology, GMOs took hold in much of global agriculture. As we all know, consumers reacted very differently to that, and especially in places like Europe, you saw quite, you know, obviously staunch opposition to that as a modern, usable, transferable, global agricultural technology tool. And so FAO, as a global organization, has individual members who come to our organization and promote and support different types of agricultural systems. And we have to be mindful that it's a global food and agricultural system, and think about how we position a variety of different cropping systems, different kinds of tools, different kinds of innovations to the farmers that are most in need of these tools. So I have always characterized it as a bit of the biotechnology versus agroecology. And what we have to do, where FAO needs to, I think, step out and be a bit bolder, is not get stuck in a state of inaction or not moving anyone forward, because politically we don't ever want to get crosswise with any one of our members. At the end of the day, we have to make sure that the people that we're working to help, the farmers most in need, whose livelihoods are affected, need to understand that there's a whole suite and a whole toolbox of innovative, new and different types of technologies and different types of production systems that are available. But it's a very, Cathy, fine needle for us to have to try and thread when it comes down to politics, it comes down to contributions, it comes down to fundraising, it comes down to communication, and how you position yourself to ultimately promote the right kinds of tools and innovations that I think are most suitable and most in need by the countries we're working to serve.
Yes, absolutely. Really, really helpful. Just one last question for each of you quickly. And we talked a bit about this last week. You know, the United States is the biggest contributor, which is fantastic. And, you know, balance with that, it seems like when we talk about how we contribute and how we add value to big issues like poverty, it shows up on the last couple of pages of our annual reports. So it's there and we do it, but we're maybe not giving it the airtime it really deserves. Any final comments around that?
So I would say that from my vantage point, two things kind of related to, I guess, maybe where directionally we'd like to see things continue to move. One is, you know, and this is where working alongside the ambassador is so helpful given our past and relationship and friendship, is that we have to make sure that there's a continued focus on globalization. And taking on these challenges at a global level. And believe me, we understand fully inside this organization that the United States is our single largest contributor. And that is something that we watch very closely, as you see even the current administration's recent actions and concerns about UN multilateral organizations, the pulling of funding from the World Health Organization. Don't think for a moment that I don't wonder if FAO could be a next victim in some way of changed budget allocations. And that's not just from the United States. That's from a number of other countries. If anybody who's participating in the call hasn't already seen this week's Economist magazine, I'd encourage you all to go out and get a copy. It's called The New World Disorder. And it essentially devotes 7 or 8 different articles to the future of the UN system as a whole. Has it accomplished what we set out for it to accomplish in the post-World War II era? Is mission creep coming in? And what are the future scenarios for the UN? And the closing arguments for there's potentially 3 different ways that the UN system might go: bedlam, bumbling, or boldness. And don't think for a moment that those 3 words in this last week since I've read that aren't resonating in my mind about what FAO needs to make sure we do so that we can be bold and that we can demonstrate the kinds of return on investment. That's a concept that, you know, Kip and I would never, you, Cathy, as business people, never think twice to use. Return on investment hasn't really truly been an operational concept in many of our UN agencies. And that's how we have to sort of reshape the way we work and the way we think.
Yeah.
Cathy,
yeah, a couple of minutes before we trigger your video. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that you know, when we look at our mission has the oversight over the 2nd largest budget in international organizations next to NATO for the United States government. And we feel very strongly that we need to do our best part in being effective and efficient with those dollars that are going in there. Believe me, I don't want to walk away from any one of these organizations as long as we can get them to deliver on what they're supposed to. But at the same time, it's their impact to policy. And for instance, as Beth and I talked about a lot about bringing in the private sector. Because I can tell you in these UN bureaucracies, so many of the people there don't really want to trust the private sector. They don't realize, though, that it's the private sector that's going to create jobs. They're going to bring in the additional assets and investments into a lot of these developing countries. As many of us are very familiar with Keith Kroc, we know in the role he serves at the State Department on Economic Development. He is leading that role there and making sure that we are effective with these dollars and doing what we can to step in front of the UN once they've created the atmosphere where we can come in and make sure that we have the economic opportunities for the people there and the private sectors investing. So I say this oftentimes, I think we count on the UN to get all this done. The reality is we got to help the UN understand that this needs to be done by the private sector, but we need to work together. So that's one of the big challenges and one of the focuses we have in our mission.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you both so much. I know we got a couple of chats and it's probably on everyone's mind. How can Indiana help? How can we help? So Michelle and Tiffany, let's put something on the Economic Club website that gives a little more information about that. We're going to play Kip's final video in a second. I just want to let you know that there's a recording of today's discussion. It's available on economicclub.com. Please join us next week on Tuesday, June 30th, as Tony Mason, President and CEO of the Indianapolis Urban League, leads a panel to discuss racial, education, economic, and health disparity. You can register for this today. We welcome any suggestions on format for these events. Thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon. Hang on for 30 seconds and we'll play you the video too. Thank you.
Wherever I am always walking with you. I'm always walking with you, but I look and you're not there. Whoever I meet, I'm always talking to you. I'm always talking to you. And I'm sad that you can't tell. Sad that you can't tell. It always ends up to one thing. When I look and you're not there.
Thank you all. We appreciate your time, and Beth and Kip, fantastic job, and look forward to next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.